Up to the mid-8th century, the Assyrian homeland and the much larger and expanding territory occupied by vassal kingdoms made up the two zones of Assyrian power. From the time of the reforms of King Tiglath-Pileser, a third zone was interposed between these two older ones, as a large part of Assyrian-dominated territory was brought under the more direct control of the Assyrian court.
This zone covered much of Mesopotamia and Syria. In it, the small vassal kingdoms were abolished, their kings being replaced by officials appointed by the Assyrian king. These provincial governors were supported by new garrisons of Assyrian troops, stationed in the provinces on a permanent basis. Babylonia also was brought under more direct Assyrian control, but in a different way from the smaller vassal kingdoms. The Babylonian throne was no longer occupied by a native dynasty, but by a member of the Assyrian royal family. Initially this was the king of Assyria himself, who thus became king of Assyria and Babylon. He ruled the country through a viceroy, a governor with very wide powers. Later, a younger son or brother of the king of Assyria occupied the throne of Babylon as a subordinate king. An efficient system of communications between royal court and provincial governors was set up, consisting of special couriers who carried messages swiftly between the king wherever he happened to be and his governors. Fire signals were also used. The roads were kept in good repair, wooden bridges were constructed across bridges, and paved ways were driven through mountainous country, to facilitate the swift passage of messages. This system acted as the precursor of later imperial road networks in the Persian, Hellenistic and Roman empires. The Assyrians also ran a state espionage service, to keep themselves informed of potential unrest. From the mid-8th century onwards, therefore, Assyria turned from being the dominant power in the region, lording it over numerous smaller or weaker kingdoms, to being a true empire with a centralized government. As such, it would have an immense influence on later world history, pioneering the techniques for administering a huge empire which would be passed on to later imperial states. The Assyrians, like previous Mesopotamians, published their own law code. This was much longer than Hammurabi's, and more sophisticated, in that it went into more detail in particular cases. However, it was noticeably harsher, with more brutal punishments for wrongdoing. The Assyrian governing system suffered from regular bouts of instability. The system had a crucial weakness at its heart. Whenever a king died and several Assyrian kings were assassinated, there was the potential for trouble as rival princes vied for the throne. Several kings had to fight their way to the throne in civil wars which sometimes lasted several years. These conflicts were not necessarily simply between different members of the royal family. It seems clear that these would be backed by factions within the Assyrian nobility. Some of these may have had roots in particular areas, for example in and around the capital city. In these circumstances, once a king had defeated his rivals, he sometimes felt the need to move the capital to another city, or indeed build a completely new city, as happened on at least 2 occasions, to reduce the influence of those nobles who had opposed him. Assyria's subject peoples naturally took advantage of these civil wars to attempt to free themselves from the heavy Assyrian yoke. Indeed, throughout their history, and despite the merciless reprisals that they visited upon defeated rebels, the Assyrians constantly had to deal with vassals seeking to shake off their rule. Because of its great prestige and wealth, the region of Babylonia played a key role in the dynamics of the Assyrian political system. The practice of appointing younger brothers of a king of Assyria to be king of Babylon had the opposite effect from that which had been intended. It was hoped that this key region would thus be brought under the tighter control of the Assyrian kings. Unfortunately, despite their close family relationship to the Assyrian king, the kings of Babylon had a tendency to rebel against them. Revolts in such an important area of the empire was a grave matter for the Assyrian king. One such period of instability started in 652, when the king of Babylon enlisted the support of many of Assyria's enemies in a revolt against his elder brother, the king of Assyria. It took many years hard fighting for the latter to put this revolt down. A generation later another rebellion by a king of Babylon would precipitate the fall of Assyria itself. On this occasion, this king succeeded in his aim of making himself king of Assyria. However, with Assyrian forces distracted by civil war, many of Assyria's subject peoples once again asserted their independence. Scythians and Cimmerians from the steppes north of the Black Sea raided unchecked through Assyrian territory in Anatolia and northern Assyria. Babylonia itself broke completely free from Assyrian rule, and very shortly the Assyria succumbed to invasions from all sides.